Accusations, apologies and acrimony as the COVID inquiry finishes in Belfast. But when the dust settles, who's likely to be left carrying the can? Welcome to The View. Tonight, as the COVID-19 inquiry in Belfast comes to an end, the barrister representing families bereaved in the pandemic makes it clear what they think of our politicians.
The message from the Northern Ireland bereaved to those who represent us is now bloody well get on and do it.
We'll assess what's emerged over the past week with tonight's studio panel. The debate over migration continues to dominate the agenda in the Republic.
We are now the third highest country per capita of receiving people claiming asylum within the EU. Only Greece and Cyprus are ahead of Ireland.
So what impact is it having on the polls? We'll get the latest from Dublin. Hello. The past 3 weeks of evidence at the COVID inquiry have exposed shortcomings, silo mentality and big personality clashes at the heart of our political system. In a moment, we'll discuss some of the most significant moments from the hearings. But first, here's Brenda Campbell, KC, for the bereaved families, making her closing submission this morning.
My lady, this past 3 weeks has been littered with oversights, omissions and failings. The impact of the 3-year absence of our Assembly, the years of underfunding of our health and civil service, single-year budgets leaving departments ravaged and worn, the silo approach of the Department of Health and other departments, the failures of the TEO to step up and step in, the unedifying dispute as to which department was to take the lead, the failure to stand up NICMA to ensure a cross-governmental approach, the failures in test, trace and isolate, the prolonged absence of a chief scientific advisor, the apparently boundless power of our chief medical officer who wore far too many hats, the failures in leadership from Westminster, the devaluing of an All-Ireland Memorandum of Understanding, the failure to properly consider in advance of or during the pandemic the need to protect our older people and those who are medically vulnerable, or indeed at any stage to consider the unequal impact of NPIs and other measures, the reckless policy of hospital discharge, the attendance of ministers at the funeral of Bobby Storey, the consequence of that attendance upon public messaging and public confidence, delays in decision-making in autumn 2020 unquestionably leading to that fatal spike in January 2021, the deliberate, egregious and abusive use of the cross-community vote, the leaks, the spins, the sectarianism, the political sniping, the wiping of phones and other devices, the corrosive, mean and hostile WhatsApp chats. Unfortunately, I could go on.
A blistering assessment from Brenda Campbell. Let's take a more in-depth look at what's emerged from the inquiry. I'm joined now by Enda McGarity, who represents the bereaved families, Professor Deirdre Heenan from Ulster University, and our political editor, Enda McClafferty. Welcome to all of you. Enda McGarity, first of all, where did that excoriating assessment come from?
Yes, well, Brenda Campbell so eloquently and powerfully captured the emotions of the bereaved families. At the outset of the closing submissions, she delineated a wide range of issues that has come out through the last 3 weeks of evidence. Many of them issues will have been well known to those that we represent for a number of years, but is perhaps only entering the public consciousness now during these weeks of evidence. So it's really capturing the anger, frustrations, exasperations of some family members and giving life to that.
And did the family members that you spoke to afterwards feel that Brenda Campbell effectively spoke for them today?
Absolutely, yes. And those family members who are attending the inquiry, either in person or by remote means, have a really good command of the evidence. And they are the real experts in the true impact of the pandemic. Of course, we had Marion Reynolds, who gave evidence at the beginning of the pandemic. She herself was an expert in many ways. And yes, of course, they're very grateful to Brenda for that.
And now they have to wait to see what happens.
Yes.
Yeah, and that may take some time. Could be 3 years before we have the findings.
Well, the inquiry's split up into a modular basis. This is Module 2C, which is specifically looking at Northern Ireland. There will be a report from Module 2, 2A, 2B and 2C, which looks at government decision-making across the UK. And that report, the Chair has said today, she makes no apologies for the time that it might take, because it's important that she gets it right. So there is no deadline set on it yet, but it could be years.
OK, Enda McClafferty, how do our politicians and our civil servants recover from a hammer blow like that?
Well, that is the big question mark, because that today was essentially like a charge sheet, and you could almost hear the voices of the families saying guilty after every charge was laid out by the KC at the inquiry. A very withering assessment, it has to be said, of what's been laid before the public over the course of the past 11 days or so, and brings us right back to the start, for instance, when Dr. Michael McBride talked about the dysfunctionality at the heart of government, talked about the enemy within having to battle all these various forces just to get the right decisions made by the parties. Now, the politicians will say, some say rightly, that they're operating in impossible circumstances. If you were to set out and design a system of government to deal with a deadly pandemic, you would not come up with a five-party mandatory coalition. They will argue, no doubt, as well, that we know now where the pandemic went next, but we didn't know back then when they were making the decisions how the cycle was going to move forward. But I think when you look at the weight of what we learned this week, there's no real justification, I think, for what happened.
We're all familiar with the story of the Emperor and the Emperor not having any clothes. Those comments today strip our politicians and civil servants bare, don't they? And there is a danger, surely, Enda, that people will now always see them without their clothes on.
Yes, for those still in office, Mark, because it has to be said that some people have moved on. Some people we heard from this week are no longer in office. But you're right, it will stay with them for a long time, I think, what we heard this week in terms of the accusations laid before them. I think Michelle O'Neill and her evidence this week was mindful of the fact that she is still very much on the crusade to be the First Minister for all. That's why I think you got a very different tone from her this week, because she has to manage the process from here on in. Also, you saw today Emma Little-Pengelly and Michelle O'Neill at Balmoral presenting the United Front as much to say, look, we have to march on. Whatever we learned this past week, government has to continue here. The wheels need to keep on turning, and we're determined to do that. And that was the message that they were sending out. On the very same day, Mark, we were getting that withering assessment of what went wrong at the heart of government here. And of course, we heard from the families on the steps of the Clayton Hotel afterwards.
Yeah, and what we heard was Michelle O'Neill saying that the inquiry's got its job to do, but this was a very difficult time because we were in the middle of a pandemic. And what we heard people saying during the inquiry over the last 3 weeks is that despite the fact that it was a global pandemic, our politicians and our civil servants still failed to clear the bar. They were still engaged in a lack of capacity, a lack of leadership, sectarianism, self-interest and political sniping, even though we were in the middle of a major global threat.
Yes, we started in a bad place because we were behind the ball straight away because of the delay, in fact, in going for the lockdown. And then, of course, we had the controversy around the closing of schools. And that's when the cohesion started to break down around the executive table. Michelle O'Neill came out and openly criticised the decision not to close schools. So you could see things starting to fray early on in the process, Mark, and I don't think we ever recovered from that.
So, Deirdre, you followed the inquiry very carefully over the last 3 weeks. In your view, can the politicians and the civil servants who found themselves in their actions being dismantled piece by painful piece in the spotlight over the past 3 weeks ever recover their authority in the public's mind?
I think really the question might be, what are the consequences of this? So we've been here before. We had the RHI inquiry. It gave a damning indictment of our system of governance. Lessons were to be learned. A lot of money was spent. What really has changed? I mean, I think the difficulty is the system of government that we have. It appears to mean there are no consequences. People will be voted back into office. People will continue to hold office. There will be no recriminations. There will be no one sacked. There will be no one removed from their post. And that really is the difficulty with our system of governance. And this inquiry has really shone a light into the dysfunctionality of what we have to accept from our government. And really, I think the people of Northern Ireland are now being asked to accept either bad governance or no governance. And is that acceptable? And how much longer are we willing to accept this? For me, the big issue here is really what has come out of this inquiry is poor leadership, a lack of political maturity and a lack of early decision making. So we know with COVID, with a global pandemic, what is essential is fleetness of foot. It's a response. We waited almost 8 weeks for an initial meeting. We knew that it had to be a multidisciplinary response, yet we weren't able to organise ourselves in such a way that we had this multidisciplinary response. And also, you know, at the early days it was, well, this is a health problem. Health's looking after this. It's a global pandemic, but they were very happy to pass the buck to health. Yet at the evidence from the inquiry, the questions were asked, didn't the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister and the Executive Office feel the need to step up and say, we are leaders. We can't be leaders in name only. They should have been in charge, had full ownership. Okay. Then we had Richard Pengelly asking the Chair, what do you mean by leadership? The Department of Health were doing what the Department of Health were expected to do.
And I want to ask you about the Department of Health's final submission to the inquiry earlier today. It was endeavouring to explain some of the decision-making that had taken place during the pandemic. What did you make of that submission?
Well, I felt they were giving themselves a clean bill of health. They were rewriting history and there were audible gasps when it was read out. I mean, the idea of saying, we did everything we could, it was a global pandemic. They did not do everything they could. It was actually that lateness of response. It was that inability to decide what they were going to do that really had an impact. We will never know exactly the impact, but to try and suggest, you know, we should give ourselves a good scorecard. I think people who were not able to see their relatives, people who were very concerned about care homes. And it was a litany of excuses to say, oh, well, there were difficulties with social care. We are the only part of the UK that has an integrated health and social care system. So actually, notionally, it should have been better for us and easier for us to respond.
Okay. You've been a critic of the Department of Health, of course, in the past, but I suppose at the end of the day, it's going to be Lady Hallett who's going to determine the rights and wrongs of what happened during the pandemic, and we'll await her conclusions with interest. I want to ask Enda, what do you make? Deirdre's given us her perspective on that submission from the Department of Health. What did the families make of it?
Well, they're deeply frustrated. I don't think it will be lost on any of them, or indeed the chair of the inquiry who has listened to the evidence for the past 3 weeks, that there has been a litany of errors in the department. Particularly in that early stage of the pandemic, and the disconnect between the Executive Office and the department was laid bare. So ultimately what's important is what the chair takes away from this, what informs her recommendations and what affects change.
Did you feel that there was an element of the Department of Health endeavouring to rewrite history today?
Well, ultimately, a big part of inquiries in general, in terms of establishing the truth, is acceptance of wrongdoing. And as I've said, there has been a very clear record of where there has been wrongdoing, omissions, errors, oversights. So at the end of the inquiry, to present a different view than what the evidence has presented could be viewed as rewriting history. OK, well, we will see again what the conclusions are as far as that is concerned. And the shortcomings of our mandatory coalition style of government came up day after day over the past 3 weeks, mostly raised, it has to be said, by politicians who were pointing to it as a flaw in the system that they were trying to operate in. But these are the very same politicians, many of them anyway, who went back into Stormont 14 weeks ago thumbing their noses at the idea of reform.
Yeah, an inescapable fact, Mark, because we do know...
Astonishing.
Reform is mentioned time and time again in institutions before they get back into government, obviously a hot topic of conversation. And then you'll find when the parties get back into the groove of government, then it slips down the agenda. But I think what we have over the course of the past 11 days is evidence of evidence whatever needed about the need to reform Stormont, because of the fact that it simply doesn't work at the most critical time in Northern Ireland's history almost, whenever decisions need to be made quickly. And they were stuck in a legal framework which worked against the swiftness of decisions and the heart of government. But I have to say as well, Mark, what we got over the course of the past 11 days was a partial picture, because there were so many questions left unanswered. We didn't hear from all the key players in this. We didn't hear from all the executive ministers. We didn't hear from the special advisors, who we know played a key role in the decision-making behind the scenes. We heard that from Arlene Foster this week when she talked about Philip Weir, who's a GP, being her special advisor. He played a key role behind the scenes. And we didn't really hear from the families. We just had one family giving testimony this week. And I think when the families in Northern Ireland looked at what's happening in Scotland, where they're having their own inquiry, sitting alongside the UK inquiry, where they're going to try and exhaust every avenue of what went wrong in Scotland, I think the families here might well feel cheated.
Deirdre, living in silos, refusing to take responsibility for making decisions, blaming others for making bad decisions. We saw all of that writ large during the RHI inquiry. We've just seen it again. People will be wondering how we move on from that. How do we know that lessons are learned?
Well, I think what people will be saying is, what are the consequences? Where is the accountability? Where is the scrutiny? Where is the transparency? And we've had report after report from all sorts of organisations talking about these failures in our system of governance. But in terms of leadership, we had Michelle O'Neill coming along, being quite contrite, but apologising for attending the Bobby Story funeral and saying she hadn't realised the hurt that it would cause. Well, that is simply not credible. Her role was as a leader, a joint leader of our government. She wasn't Betty from Bangor, she wasn't Claire from Coleraine, she was the joint head of government, and her actions had consequences.
And the people who had organised that funeral had been liaising with the PSNI about how it would be conducted.
Which is extraordinary, because really when people watch that, they think, are there some people who are above the law? These are people that are making the rules, but they're above the law. What impact does it have on the families who can't grieve in a way that they've come to expect?
And we also had Arlene Foster, who was the First Minister at the time, having a very difficult day in front of the inquiry yesterday.
Well, I think we witnessed what we now come to expect. Classic Arlene. She was... I think really she just lacked humility. She was passive aggressive. She was very uncomfortable. She was sometimes quite rude, actually. But at no point was there empathy or compassion, accepting that she had a role, that her leadership role isn't what it could have been. And we had the KC really demonstrating how important it is to be over the jot and tittle. She clearly was over the detail and the jot and tittle. And in a gentle but devastating way, she really showed up that lack of knowledge, and to actually suggest, oh, well, yes, a key paper came along, it came to my office, but it didn't arrive in my door. I mean, I just think this is leadership writ large. Is this what we should accept? Is this acceptable?
OK, can I ask you just finally, Enda McGarity, we know that there are going to be further investigations in Scotland. Do the families want a specific bespoke inquiry into what happened here in Northern Ireland? Will they settle for anything less?
Well, ultimately, they'll have to see how the further investigations play out in the other modules. But ultimately, if there are gaps in the investigations that have happened so far, then a devolved inquiry will have to mop up anything that hasn't been examined.
So there will be those who will be pushing for that, you think, potentially in the months, maybe even the years ahead?
Yes.
OK, well, we will see. We will continue to watch that with interest. We need to leave it there for now. Thank you all very much indeed for coming in to join us tonight, and I'll talk to you a little bit later in the programme. But we're going to turn our attention now to the other big talking point this week, the debate over migration. On Monday, the High Court here ruled that the government's law, which enables migrants to be sent to Rwanda, doesn't apply in Northern Ireland. Now, a high-profile TD has suggested that could allow the Republic to send some of those seeking international protection there back across the border. When I spoke to Fianna Fáil's Jim O'Callaghan earlier, I began by asking him how concerned he is at Monday's ruling.
Well, we had an important High Court decision in Ireland on the 22nd of March of this year. And as a result of that decision, the High Court ruled that the United Kingdom, which we had designated as a safe third country, could no longer be so designated. And the High Court in Dublin indicated that there were a number of defects in the legislation that had been enacted here. Now, the Minister has indicated she's bringing forward correcting legislation to get over that. But I suppose a point that has been made by a number of politicians here and legal academics is that, well, what's the point of designating the United Kingdom as a safe third country if the Rwanda scheme is going to be operational? And the basis of them saying that is that an Irish court would say it's not safe to return somebody to the United Kingdom. However, if there's going to be different procedures applicable within the United Kingdom between Northern Ireland and Britain, well, in that instance, I think it is open to a country to designate as a safe third country part of that country.
But the bottom line is that you don't want these people in the Republic of Ireland, and your solution is to pack them off to Northern Ireland. That's it in a nutshell, isn't it? You can't get away from that reality.
No, that's not it. And I think it's difficult to have a discussion about this without looking at the numbers that we're dealing with in the Republic. And secondly, this is not an issue that's going to be resolved by either jurisdiction on this island on its own. Like in the same way as other things we face, such as COVID, have to be really approached on a collaborative basis, I certainly think the issue of immigration needs to be dealt with on a collaborative basis by both jurisdictions on this island. Like, as I said to you, what really needs to define this discussion is the very significant increase in numbers of people who've come to Ireland to seek international protection. Back in 2019, 4,700 people applied for international protection in Ireland, in this country. In 2022 and 2023, it was 13,500 in each of those years. Now already this year, it's 8,000, and we're looking at getting, I would have thought, towards the region of 26,000 this year. So like, that is the reason why this issue has become such a dominant political issue in the Republic. And I suppose you also need to take into account that in the past 2 years or so, we've taken in 106,000 people who fled the war in Ukraine, and we've provided accommodation. So the background to this is really the inability of the Irish government to provide accommodation to everyone who's seeking international protection or who's been granted temporary protection.
Well, let's not forget that's your government. You're a member of Fianna Fáil, and Fianna Fáil is one of the parties in the governing coalition.
I'm fully aware of that,
line,
Mark.
just to be clear about this, the bottom line for you is that too many asylum seekers are currently coming to the Republic. Is that it?
It is clearly the case that when you look at the figures that have arrived into Ireland this year alone, we're talking about 8,000 have arrived already this year. We're looking towards 26,000. Like, I know the discussion generally is about, and we do have an obligation to provide accommodation for those who have come in. And already this year, we've provided 4,000 extra spaces. We're providing 30,000 accommodation spaces to people seeking international protection. We're providing 70,000 accommodation spaces to people who've been granted temporary protection. Like, it is unquestionably the case that the rise in numbers is a consequence. And as well as just trying to look at this problem by saying we need to get more accommodation, we also, in my opinion, perfectly legitimately need to say, what steps can we introduce in order to reduce the numbers who are coming to Ireland seeking international protection?
There are campaigners in the Republic who want to see the number of migrants coming in to the country reduced dramatically, and they want migrants who are in the country to be removed, and they campaign under the slogan, Ireland is full. You are not using that language, but you are effectively telling me you think Ireland is full.
I'm not suggesting Ireland is full. The population of this island back in 1840 was 8 million. We haven't even reached that population yet. What I am saying, and I think it's demonstrably the case, and if you're down in Dublin, if you see Mount Street or if you see by the canal, it is demonstrably the case that we are not able to provide accommodation to everyone who's coming in seeking international protection. Now, if you want, we can just ignore that as a political issue. And if centre-ground parties such as Fianna Fáil ignore it, well, then you're right, it will be a debate dominated by the extremes. But my view is that, and it's a difficult task, there's no simple solution to this. My view is that as a government, we need to try to ensure that we introduce measures that will have the effect of reducing the numbers who are applying for international protection. Because if we don't do that, we're just going to find ourselves in the unsustainable position as we see at present, with people in tents by the canals and tents on Mount Street.
The solicitor for the young Iranian man whose case prompted this week's High Court ruling spoke to me on our Red Lines podcast this week, and she said your comments about designating Northern Ireland as a safe third country were very unhelpful because they diminish people who need our help, people who are fleeing persecution. It reduces them, she said, to being just numbers and percentages and forgets they're real people. In fact, she said your comments were, to quote her, quite disgraceful. What do you say in response?
Well, I would reject those comments. And the easiest thing in politics is just to say nothing. But we do have to have an honest conversation about what is happening here. And also we need to recognize that not everyone who is applying for international protection is granted international protection. In fact, last year in the Republic, 60% were refused international protection. So it may be the case that her client was a person very much deserving of international protection. But if the system is just going to operate on the basis that everyone who applies is entitled to stay, well, on that basis, let's not have a system at all. Let's not have this quasi-judicial process where people are assessed to see whether or not they're entitled to stay or not. If that is the system, we need to recognize that not everyone is entitled to stay, and we need to bring in measures to give effect to that. And of course, I've always recognized in this conversation as well that people who've come here, I've great sympathy for them, but just because I've sympathy doesn't mean I can abandon my other virtues as a politician. I've also got to look at it with pragmatism and practicality and to think, well, what can this country deal with in terms of the accommodation that we can provide?
Let me ask you about what you think needs to happen at the border then to stem the flow of migrants north to south. The Garda Commissioner, Drew Harris, has now confirmed on the record that checkpoints were set up in February on the M1 motorway between Belfast and Dublin. We know 47 buses travelling southbound to Dublin were stopped and a total of 25 people were detected entering the state illegally. And all of the migrants were refused leave to stay and were returned to the UK. 19 by ferry to Holyhead and 6 by train to Belfast. Can I ask you, was that a good result?
Well, listen, it is a question that was asked. The Garda Commissioner has provided an answer in respect of it. But can I just agree with you in terms of there is no solution to this if it is just Northern Ireland trying to transfer people who have sought international protection towards the south and vice versa. This problem and this issue cannot be resolved without there being collaboration. Listen, we have a common travel area, but sometimes it's forgotten that the common travel area is there for the benefit and advantages of citizens of the United Kingdom and Ireland and indeed the Isle of Man. So there were rules in respect of the common travel area. And those decisions, I think, that were made by the Commissioner, they obviously predated the decision of the Irish High Court on the 22nd of March. But even notwithstanding the fact that since the 22nd of March, the UK is no longer a safe third country in Irish law, there's always been the case where there's cooperation between the United Kingdom Border Force and indeed the Garda Immigration Bureau, where you don't allow secondary movements within the common travel area.
OK, as your party's justice spokesperson, just so that I'm clear, do you want to see more checks like that between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland in future?
Well, I think there is some benefit to ensure that the rules of the common travel area are upheld. But I'm also a realist. It's not going to be feasible to police the border. It's not going to be feasible to ensure that every border crossing is stopped. So, no, I'm not looking for that.
If you were Justice Minister, what actually would you do? Because you're a politician.
Yeah, first of all, I would enforce the law. We have a lot of laws in Ireland that we aren't using. In terms of since 2023, the beginning of 2023, approximately 7,500 people have been refused international protection. Yet only 100 or so have been deported. So a system like this, and I know it may sound harsh and people involved in the legal profession may think it's inappropriate to say this, but it doesn't operate effectively unless if people are refused international protection, they're deported or leave, because otherwise there's no purpose to having a quasi-judicial process of assessing whether you're entitled to stay or not.
And where would you send them?
If it's been determined that they're not entitled to international protection, it means the country from where they came is not persecuting them, is not unsafe to them. And so the obvious solution is you send them back to the country from where they came.
And if, for example, they'd come here from the United Kingdom, Rishi Sunak has made it very clear that while some migrants have been accepted back by the UK government recently, in future he says that will stop. It's not happening anymore.
Well, to see what happens in respect of the British government's, I suppose, policies and how they become operational. But listen, all I can do and all politicians in Dublin can do is try to respond to the policy issues that have arisen as a result of what's happening here. Like, we're responsible for our own immigration laws. And like, one thing that's apparent is that we are now the third highest country per capita of receiving people claiming asylum within the EU. Only Greece and Cyprus are ahead of Ireland. So something unusual has happened, Mark. And the easy thing to do is just to ignore it and say, okay, let's just keep providing accommodation. Something unusual has happened. The numbers are increasing so significantly that, as I say, we need to have a policy response here ourselves. I'm not looking for the United Kingdom government to come up with a solution, but our solution has to include enforcing the law and using the law as it is at present to ensure that the system operates effectively. And we try to reduce the numbers who are applying here.
I just wonder how conscious you are about the fact that you are treading a very difficult path. You're obviously thinking very carefully about what you're saying and you're choosing your language very carefully. But do you accept that in some, if not all, of what you say, your comments are open to misinterpretation?
No, I wouldn't accept that. I'm sure there are people who want to misinterpret them. And if they do, I can't stop their deliberate misinterpretation. But what I do think is important is that centre ground politicians such as myself in Ireland and others in my party, Fianna Fáil, that were able to engage with a political issue that is a very significant political issue for the people in the country at present. And if politicians like me and my colleagues in Fianna Fáil don't engage with it, well, then it's going to be an issue that's going to become monopolised by the extremes. And that's extremely to the disadvantage of everyone concerned. So I don't think we should be fearful on the centre ground and having a discussion about it.
Fianna Fáil's Jim O'Callaghan speaking to me earlier. Let's stick with this story and hear from Gavin Riley, political correspondent for Virgin Media News. Gavin, thanks for joining us tonight. What did you make of what Mr O'Callaghan had to say there?
I agreed with your last observation that he was choosing his words very carefully. I think in a way he's really managed to hit the nail on the head as regards some of the difficulty about what the present government that Jim supports has done or rather is not doing. There's a couple of basic blunt red lines. Firstly, that the Republic, because it's a signatory to international refugee conventions and the like, cannot limit the number of asylum seekers on an overall national basis. You simply cannot decide that you're only going to take a certain number of thousand every year and then turn the rest away, because the Republic has obligations to consider every case. So you can't put a stem on the overall numbers that are coming in. Therefore, if the Republic wants to manage or to try and do better about administering the numbers that it currently has, you either try and change the welfare or funding proposition to make the Republic less attractive, or you use whatever levers are at your disposal to return people to other countries where they might have outstanding claims pending and where therefore they wouldn't have the right to run a parallel claim in the Republic as well. And the difficulty that Jim has identified there is that if it is the case that there is some kind of reciprocal deal between Ireland and the UK whereby someone who applies in one jurisdiction then crosses over into another is supposed to be returned to the first one, then evidently that isn't very well functional. And so if there is a deal that the Irish government under the present Minister Helen McEntee was able to negotiate back in 2020, then why hasn't that deal been invoked more regularly? And that points to what Jim was really getting at there, which is the idea that the present government might have some means at its disposal to ease the burden under which it's currently placed and hasn't been using them as best it can. I'm
interested to know what you think or how you think others in the Republic will hear what he had to say tonight. Mr O'Callaghan clearly saying he doesn't believe Ireland is full, a line used by many anti-migrant campaigners, but at the same time pointing out the country is struggling with the big numbers coming in.
It's a little bit of an old late show, kind of one for everyone in the audience, because it can be inferred and interpreted in so many different ways. But one thing which, again, I have to come back to is the fact that he's saying, well, if Ireland isn't full and the population was higher in the 1840s, and by the government's own census figures, there are about 160,000 vacant properties in the Republic. So maybe it's a case that properties have been sort of miscategorised or misaccrued rather than all of them being full. But it still then boils back to, well, if the country is not full, but yet the government is finding it so difficult to provide safe lodging and shelter for the asylum seekers that are coming to the country, then it must be a government failing. So while it might be an attempt for Jim O'Callaghan to try and maybe mainstream this conversation and to not allow it to fall into the unregulated environs of the far right. As he said, if it is going to be adopted by the mainstream, then it is damaging for the government that he himself is a member of, because once again it points to a difficulty in the administration of how all this has been done.
If the government is struggling, is the opposition succeeding?
One might have thought that until we saw an opinion poll this time about 24 hours ago, but today's Irish Times suggests that Sinn Féin, the lead opposition party, which has been notably more critical of Ireland's asylum and immigration policy in the last couple of weeks, doesn't appear to be harvesting any kind of political dividend. An Ipsos poll for today's edition of the Irish Times showed that Sinn Féin support had dropped by 5 points in 3 months. They're now at 23%, which is exactly the same as Fine Gael. That was a gap of 11 points only about a year ago. Back in 2022, that was a gap of 18 points. And now those two parties are dead level, and Fianna Fáil only 3 points further back on 20%. Now, it's only one poll. There's that whole thing of the trend being your friend. But if that is the sort of result that we were to see replicated at the local and European elections in a couple of weeks' time, one will be wondering exactly whether Sinn Féin has properly calibrated this slight hardening of its own language. And indeed, it still will be interesting to see, of course, how many seats in the local elections, as well as the Europeans, might be won by people who run specifically on immigration tickets.
Always good to hear your thoughts, Gavin. Thanks very much indeed for joining us on the programme tonight. Appreciate your time. Let's just bring in Enda McLafferty for a final word. We'll maybe come on to those poll numbers in a moment or two, but let's just bring the story back to Northern Ireland for a moment or two. How will Monday's High Court ruling play out here, do you think, Enda?
Well, I think it will be with us for as long as the COVID inquiry, because there's clearly some road to run in terms of the legal battle around this. The government has made it clear that it's going to appeal this ruling to the High Court here in Northern Ireland, and then we can expect it ultimately to end up, I would imagine, in the Supreme Court in London. Now, that's going to take some time. As we know, there's every possibility that we might have a general election before we get the outcome of that whole court passage. And in that case, we could well find ourselves with a new government at number 10 if the polls in the UK are correct, and the Labour government has already indicated that it plans to abolish the Rwanda policy and also repeal this particular piece of legislation. Now, I think that's something that the DUP is certainly hoping for, because as long as this hangs around, the more difficult it becomes for the party to continue to sell the deal it negotiated with the government. Yeah,
it becomes an opportunity for the DUP's opponents at an election to make hay out of this situation, yes, potentially.
Easy to weaponise for them, Mark, because it reminds people continually of the deal, which the party's opponents say they didn't really properly negotiate with the government, and they would say this is one of the many flaws that exist in the negotiations. Now, for their part, the DUP insist that it was all about trade, their negotiations. They were concerned with the Irish Sea border and the movement of goods, and as far as they were concerned in the negotiations, they had to bank what they had, essentially, and restore the institutions so that the bread and butter issues here could be properly dealt with.
Gavin mentioned that Irish Times poll, and it is only a snapshot. You've got a copy of the Irish Times in front of you there. We've got local elections coming up, European elections, and ultimately, of course, a general election in the Republic within the next year. Do you think that our First Minister, Michelle O'Neill, is likely to be wheeled out by Sinn Féin in the Republic of Ireland in the coming weeks, because she's a popular figure down there?
No doubt about that, Mark. She is the secret weapon for Sinn Féin as regards getting points, that is for sure, and securing votes. And you can see, for instance, in the polling there today, Mary Lou McDonald sitting at 36% in her own popularity, and that's 4 points behind Micheál Martin, who remains the most popular leader in the Republic. And there's no doubt about it, I think there will be a real concerted campaign by Sinn Féin now to maximise all their weapons, if you like, to try and get as many votes as possible over the line. Because while this poll today would indicate that the party's support is starting to go in the opposite direction, they will say, of course, that the real poll comes in 3 weeks' time. And remember, Mark, in the local government elections, they lost almost half their councillors last time round in 2019. So whatever they're going to get is going to be an improvement on that.
Interesting stuff. And as ever, thanks very much indeed for coming in to join us. That's all we've time for tonight. I'll be back at the weekend with Sunday Politics at the usual time of 10 o'clock on BBC One. Do join me for that. The latest edition of our Red Lines podcast is available on BBC Sounds. It looks in detail at the ongoing migrants issue and what it means on both sides of the border. For now, though, from all of us, thanks for watching. Night-night.